In this series of videos, we'll look at the presidency of James Madison, who was president from the election of 1808 through the election of 1816. Madison was from a prominent Virginia planter family, and you can see his estate Montpelier here. Interestingly, Madison was a friend of Thomas Jefferson, and his Montpelier was very close to Jefferson's Monticello. By the way, Madison was followed in the presidency by another Virginian, James Monroe, and Virginia by that point was becoming known as the mother of presidents. Anyway, Madison was small and quiet, not really imposing, but the man was really brilliant. He'd been in the Virginia House of Delegates and in the Continental Congress, and had helped organize the Constitutional Convention. It was Madison who was author of the famous Virginia Plan with its idea of checks and balances, which of course became the basis for the U.S. Constitution, and for that reason he's known as the father of the U.S. Constitution. With John Jay and Alexander Hamilton, he was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, which encouraged ratification of the Constitution. After the Constitution's ratification, he was a leader in the House of Representatives, and he was a close personal friend of another Virginian, George Washington. But he came to oppose the Federalist agenda of Alexander Hamilton, which he thought centralized the power of the federal government too much. And so he became even more so an ally of Thomas Jefferson, and in time a leader in the Democratic-Republican Party that was coalescing around Jefferson. Early in his term, he led the War of 1812, but later he was president during the era of good feelings, all of which will be discussed in later videos. In the 1808 election, Madison fought James Monroe for the Democratic-Republican nomination. The party was kind of formalized by the 12th Amendment. And, Madison had been Jefferson's Secretary of State, and just prior to this, and Secretary of State was sort of seen as a stepping stone to the president. The Federalists nominated Charles Pinckney. In the 1808 election, Madison defeated Pinckney in a rather close election, at least not routes like earlier. It was 122 to 47 in the Electoral College. Pinckney got all of the Federalist New England states except Vermont. And the Federalists, actually, they gained seats in Congress. Certainly impactful in this election was the fact that Jefferson had passed the Embargo Act of 1807, and the economy was teetering, and the Democratic Republicans were not as popular as they'd been before. In his first inaugural in early 1809, Madison called for a federal program of economic growth, and this was clearly a sign that while he was a Democratic Republican, he recognized that the nation was changing. He wanted a bank, the U.S. Bank of the United States, renewed. Jefferson had finally let it die out when its charter had expired in 1811. Madison called for a better system of transportation, like canals shown here on the right, and he even called for raising the tariff. These are things that Democratic Republicans wouldn't have done before. You can see his inaugural written out on the left. In the 1812 election, Madison defeated New York Governor DeWitt Clinton. Interestingly, DeWitt Clinton was the nephew of Jefferson's vice president in 1808, George Clinton, also from New York. DeWitt Clinton was upset in 1812, as were some Democratic Republicans, about Madison's relations with Britain. They feared a war and thought Madison was leaving him there. He ran on sort of a fusion ticket of Federalists who were against the war and Democratic Republicans who were against it. Another interesting thing about the election of 1812 was that Madison's new vice president was Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts. Elbridge Gerry is going to die in 1814 while he was vice president, but he's most famous today for being previously governor of Massachusetts. And while he was governor of Massachusetts, he'd signed a highly partisan bill that sort of stacked the congressional districts in favor of his party. And that process of making partisan congressional districts was named for him, and we think of it today as gerrymandering. In any event, this concludes the first little video on an overview of James Madison.